Urgency doesn't disappear because you stopped wanting. It disappears because the version of you who needed to want that way is no longer central. That version ran on pressure, on contrast, on proving something. When identity shifts, pressure systems shut. Urgency belongs to a specific relationship between identity and outcome. When that relationship ends, urgency ends with it. Here's the part that's rarely recognized. Down first. And the body knows this before the mind does. This most people think something is wrong with their thoughts or emotions. That's not the issue. The issue is how you're interpreting what's already happening inside you. Before reality changes, there's always a quiet moment. Nothing dramatic happens. No signs, no emotions, no breakthroughs. Life keeps moving, you keep responding. From the outside, everything looks normal, but internally, something is being read the wrong way. Not loudly, not obviously, just enough to create a small distortion in how you experience yourself. And almost everyone overlooks it, because it doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like nothing, a kind of emotional neutrality, a pause that doesn't announce itself, a sense that something should be happening but isn't. So the mind fills the gap. It labels the feeling as boredom, or lack of motivation, or confusion, or I don't know what I want anymore. But that interpretation is already part of the delay. Because what's actually happening isn't absence, it's transition. And if you don't notice this misreading, if you keep responding to it as if something is wrong, the shift doesn't stop. It just waits, quietly. There's a very specific feeling that appears during this phase. Not anxiety, not sadness, not fear. It's quieter than that. It feels like you're slightly out of step with yourself. You wake up and nothing is wrong, but nothing feels fully right either. Your routines still work. Your life still functions. People around you see no reason for concern, and yet internally you feel like you're responding to life a half-second too late, or a half-second too early, like you're arriving just after the meaning leaves the room. That's usually the first sign, not pain, not crisis. A subtle loss of resonance. You might notice it in small moments. A conversation that used to energize you now feels oddly flat. A goal you worked toward suddenly feels neutral once it's close. A plan that made sense logically doesn't move you emotionally anymore. So you start asking yourself quiet questions. What's wrong with me? Why don't I feel the way I should? Why am I not more excited? Those questions feel reasonable, but they're based on an assumption that isn't true. The assumption is that your internal signals are malfunctioning. They aren't. Your interpretation of them is. Here's the part almost no one is told. When perception begins to shift, it doesn't announce itself as clarity. It announces itself as ambiguity. The mind expects change to feel like insight, like motivation, like certainty. But identity doesn't update that way. Identity loosens first. And when it loosens, meaning temporarily thins out, not because it's gone, because it's reorganizing. Most people have been trained to fear that thinning. They've learned to associate meaning with intensity. Strong emotion means alive. Strong desire means on track. Strong struggle means growth. So when intensity fades, they assume something is wrong. They try to recreate feeling. They stimulate themselves with noise, content, urgency, pressure. They tell themselves they just need to get back into it. But you can't get back into something that has already completed its function. And completion doesn't feel like success at first. It feels like indifference. This is where the internal misreading deepens. Instead of recognizing indifference as a signal of transition, you read it as disconnection. Instead of sensing detachment as alignment shifting, you label it as loss. So you resist it. You keep acting as if the old emotional responses should still be there. And when they aren't, you question yourself, not the interpretation, yourself. Notice how subtle this is. Nothing collapses. There's no dramatic contrast to wake you up, which is why this phase can last months, sometimes years. Not because change is slow, but because perception hasn't caught up. The moment perception adjusts, reality follows quickly. But until then, everything feels slightly delayed. You might recognize this pattern. You feel like you're waiting, but you don't know for what. You feel like movement should happen, but forcing it feels wrong. You feel suspended between versions of yourself. And because modern language has no space for this experience, people default to psychological explanations. Burnout, avoidance, fear of success, fear of failure. Those explanations don't quite fit, but they're close enough to keep you from looking deeper. Here's something important. This phase isn't asking you to fix anything. It's asking you to stop mislabeling what's happening. Because the moment you stop calling transition a problem, your nervous system relaxes. And when the nervous system relaxes, perception sharpens. Not intellectually, somatically. You start sensing what fits again. There's a quiet intelligence operating here. It doesn't push you forward. It doesn't pull you back. It simply stops supplying energy to what no longer reflects you. That withdrawal of energy is what you feel as flatness. But flatness isn't emptiness. It's neutrality before reorientation. Like standing still after a long trip while your sense of direction recalibrates. Most people never let that recalibration finish. They interrupt it. They rush to define themselves again. They pick a new identity too quickly. A new story, a new role. And because it's chosen from the same perceptual lens, it recreates the same cycle. Effort, intensity, achievement. Then, thinning again. But when you don't interrupt this phase, when you let the misreading dissolve on its own, something very different happens. You don't find a new path. You recognize one. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels obvious. And later, looking back, you wonder how you ever missed it. For now, it's enough to notice this. If what you're experiencing feels familiar but difficult to describe, if it doesn't feel painful, just quietly disorienting, if your life looks stable, but your internal reference point feels outdated, you're not broken. You're between interpretations, and that space, as uncomfortable as it can feel, is where perception quietly updates itself. One of the first things people notice, often without realizing it, is that urgency disappears. Not all at once. Not dramatically. It just fades. Things that once felt time-sensitive no longer trigger the same internal pressure. Deadlines still exist, but they don't grip you the same way. Decisions still matter, but they don't carry emotional weight. And this is where the misreading becomes dangerous. Because urgency has been mistaken for alignment for a long time. Most people grew up believing that if something mattered, it should feel urgent. If you cared, you rushed. If you wanted something, you pushed. If you were on the right path, there was friction, effort, tension. So when urgency disappears, the mind panics. It says, I'm losing my drive. I'm becoming lazy. I'm falling behind. I don't care anymore. That can't be good. But urgency is not a universal signal. It's an internal contradiction. Externally, life still asks you to respond the same way. Internally, your system no longer generates the same signals. So you try to manufacture urgency. You give yourself artificial deadlines. You tell yourself stories about consequences. You compare yourself to others. It works, briefly, but it always feels forced, because urgency cannot be recreated once alignment has changed. Notice how subtle this is. Nothing is wrong. You can still perform. You can still function. You can still achieve, but the emotional charge behind the movement is gone. And without that charge, everything feels slightly hollow. Not empty, hollow. This is where many people start overthinking. They analyze themselves. They dissect their emotions. They look for trauma, blocks, resistance. But overanalysis is another attempt to restore urgency. If you can explain what's wrong, you can fix it, and then pressure will return. But pressure is not the goal anymore. Alignment is. And alignment doesn't shout. There's a quiet truth here. When urgency fades naturally, it means something inside you no longer believes time is being wasted. Not because time doesn't matter, but because you have stopped chasing validation through speed. Speed was part of an old agreement. An agreement that said, if I move fast enough, I'll arrive somewhere meaningful. That agreement dissolves before you consciously update it. So the body stops cooperating. This is why people in this phase often feel oddly calm and uneasy at the same time. Calm, because the nervous system is no longer in fight or flight. Uneasy, because the mind doesn't know how to navigate without urgency. Urgency was orientation. Without it, direction feels unclear. Here's something important to recognize. Lack of urgency does not mean lack of movement. It means movement is reorganizing. Instead of pushing forward, perception starts scanning sideways. You become more observant, more selective, less reactive. You might even feel slower, but what's actually happening is refinement. Think of it this way. Urgency moves you quickly down a narrow path. Alignment opens a wider field. At first, that field feels disorienting. Too many options, no clear pressure, no obvious next step. So the mind calls it confusion. But it's not confusion, it's the absence of compulsion. You don't need to decide what this means yet. Just notice how different it feels from being stuck. People often say, "I feel like I'm wasting time." But time doesn't feel wasted when perception is aligned. It only feels wasted when you're measuring it against an outdated goal. When that goal dissolves, the measurement tool becomes useless. So time feels strange, elastic, undefined, quiet. This is also why advice becomes irritating during this phase. Just do something. Take action. Push through. Those suggestions assume urgency is missing because of hesitation. But hesitation isn't the problem. Misinterpretation is. You're trying to move from an old center, and that center is no longer active. Here's a subtle shift that happens if you stop fighting this. Instead of asking, "What should I do?" you begin noticing, "What naturally pulls my attention now?" Not dramatically, not obsessively, just small, consistent curiosity. That curiosity doesn't feel urgent. It feels clean. Later, much later, people realize this was the moment reality began reorganizing. Not when they took action, not when they decided something, but when they stopped forcing urgency to return. That's when perception caught up. And once perception aligns, reflection follows quickly. For now, it's enough to recognize this. If urgency has faded, and you've been judging yourself for it, if pressure no longer motivates you the way it used to, if trying harder feels wrong instead of noble, you're not regressing. You're exiting a pressure-based identity. And that exit always feels like uncertainty before it feels like freedom. There's a moment in this process where the mind makes a quiet but critical mistake. It notices the absence of emotional charge and immediately assumes something is missing. Not consciously, automatically, because the brain has been trained to associate feeling with meaning. Strong emotion means relevance. Weak emotion means danger. So when alignment begins to shift and emotional intensity drops, the brain doesn't recognize it as refinement. It calls it indifference. Indifference sounds like apathy, like disengagement, like giving up. And that label carries weight, because no one wants to believe they've stopped caring. So the mind pushes back. It tries to reignite emotion. It revisits old dreams, old fears, old motivations. It tells stories about how things used to matter, but memory can't restore alignment. It can only remind you of who you were. This is where people start saying things like, "I don't feel passion anymore. I feel numb. I feel disconnected." But numbness isn't what this is. Numbness is absence caused by overload or suppression. This is different. This is neutrality caused by coherence shifting. Here's the distinction that almost no one is taught to feel. Indifference feels dull and heavy. Alignment without urgency feels light and spacious. They're often confused because both lack intensity, but they live in completely different parts of the body. Indifference collapses posture. Alignment relaxes it. Indifference drains attention. Alignment sharpens it. The difference is subtle but unmistakable once noticed. The problem is, most people never let themselves feel that difference. They label the experience too quickly, and once labeled, perception locks in. If you call alignment apathy, your nervous system responds as if something is wrong. Tension returns, self-judgment activates, pressure rebuilds, and the transition is interrupted. There's a strange irony here. The moment you stop caring the old way is the moment you're capable of caring the true way. But because the old way was loud and the new way is quiet, the brain assumes the volume dropped because meaning disappeared. It didn't. Noise disappeared. This is why people in this phase often feel emotionally flat, but perceptually awake. They're less reactive, less dramatic, less invested in outcomes, but more observant, more precise, more present. That combination confuses the mind, so it tries to restore drama. You might notice this pattern. You deliberately provoke emotion through music, memory, stimulation, just to feel something again. And it works, for a moment. But afterward, the quiet returns, and this time, it feels heavier. Not because the quiet is wrong, because you resisted it. Nothing here is asking you to feel more, only to notice how you're already feeling without labeling it too quickly. Here's something that's rarely said. Alignment is not emotionally intense. Alignment is emotionally clear. Intensity belongs to contrast. When contrast fades, clarity remains. But clarity doesn't excite the mind, it stabilizes the system, and stability feels boring to a mind trained on stimulation. This is also why people sometimes confuse this phase with depression, but depression pulls you inward and downward. This phase feels neutral but open. You're not withdrawing from life, you're disengaging from unnecessary friction. There's a collective misunderstanding here. We've been taught that transformation should feel dramatic, that awakening should feel powerful, that change should feel like fire, but real internal reorientation feels like exhaling after holding your breath for years. No fireworks, just relief. When the brain mislabels that relief as indifference, it creates suffering where none was required. Not because the experience is painful, but because the interpretation is. And interpretation shapes experience. Here's the deeper layer. The mind uses emotion to predict safety. When emotions quiet down, prediction fails. The mind doesn't know what comes next, so it fills the gap with concern. Am I losing myself? Is something wrong? Will this last? But what's actually happening is that you're no longer being driven by emotional prediction. You're entering perceptual presence. And presence doesn't need rehearsal. Later, much later, people describe this period as the moment they stopped fighting themselves. Not because they decided to, because the fight lost relevance. And when relevance disappears, conflict dissolves. If this block feels uncomfortable to listen to, that's natural. It challenges a deeply ingrained belief that caring must hurt, that meaning must be loud, that movement must be charged. Those beliefs are learned. Alignment is not. So for now, it's enough to notice this mislabeling when it happens. When you think, I don't care anymore, pause just long enough to ask, does this feel heavy or does it feel quiet? The answer will tell you everything, without explanation. There's a moment, usually unnoticed at first, when effort stops producing the same results, not because you stopped trying, not because you did something wrong, but because reality has stopped responding to pressure. This is deeply confusing for people who learn that results come from pushing. You do the same things, you apply the same discipline, you show up the same way, and the response is neutral, not rejection, not resistance, just no echo. That's often when people say, nothing is working anymore. I'm doing everything right, but nothing's moving. I don't understand what I'm missing. But what's missing isn't action, it's resonance. There's a misunderstanding baked into how effort is taught. Effort is treated like a universal currency. Put enough in, get results out. But effort only works when it's aligned with identity. When identity shifts, effort loses leverage. It becomes noise instead of signal. This is the phase where reality starts acting like a mirror instead of a reward system, not giving you what you want, not punishing you for mistakes, just reflecting what state you're actually in. And mirrors don't respond to force, they respond to position. You can't argue with a mirror, you can't convince it. You can only stand differently in front of it, and standing differently doesn't require effort. It requires accuracy. This is where people get tired, not physically, existentially, because they realize something uncomfortable. Trying harder won't fix this, and that realization feels like loss, until it feels like relief. Many people resist this point longer than any other. They double down, they consume more information, they refine strategies, they optimize themselves. But optimization assumes the target is correct. Alignment questions the target, and questioning the target feels dangerous to the mind. If effort feels strangely ineffective right now, that doesn't mean you're failing. It may mean you're no longer meant to push from the same place. There's a quiet shift that happens when resistance drops. Instead of asking, how do I make this happen? You start noticing, what already responds when I'm not forcing? Small things, unexpected messages, coincidences without drama, situations resolving without pressure, not miracles, reflections. At first, the mind dismisses these moments. They don't count. They're random. That's not enough, because the mind expects effort to precede result. But reflection works the other way around. State precedes outcome. This is why alignment feels passive to the ego. It doesn't involve striving, it involves honesty. And honesty feels vulnerable, because it removes the illusion of control. There's a subtle relief in this phase. You stop trying to convince reality. You stop negotiating with life. And in that quiet, things start rearranging, not all at once, gradually. This is also why many people later say, everything changed when I stopped trying to make it change, not because they gave up, because they stopped misinterpreting what was being asked of them. Reality doesn't need you to push, it needs you to be positioned accurately, and accuracy feels calm, undramatic, almost boring, until you notice how much resistance disappears. Some people encounter these ideas more deeply through frameworks like parallel realities, not as concepts to believe, but as mirrors that help language catch up to experience. Not instructions, recognition tools. For now, it's enough to notice this shift. If effort feels oddly ineffective, if pushing drains you instead of moving you, if small, quiet moments feel more right than big, forced actions, reality hasn't stopped responding. It's just responding to something different now. There's a point where the language of change stops fitting, because nothing feels like it's changing. It feels like you're standing slightly to the side of yourself, not dissociated, not split, just adjacent. Like you're aware that the version of you responding to life right now is not the same one who used to answer these questions, and that realization doesn't arrive as a thought, it arrives as a sensation. You notice it when you almost react the old way, and then don't. The impulse shows up but it doesn't complete. The argument that used to hook you doesn't land. The desire that used to pull you doesn't activate. The fear that used to rush in doesn't organize your body anymore. And for a moment, you're left in silence. That silence isn't empty, it's unclaimed. This is where the idea of parallel versions becomes useful, not as a belief, but as a description of something already happening inside you. You haven't become someone else. You've stopped fully occupying one position, and you haven't fully settled into the next yet. So experience feels layered. It can feel like this. You remember how you used to think, and you can still access it, but it no longer feels like home. At the same time, the way you will think hasn't stabilized, so you float between reference points. Old reactions feel too loud, new reactions feel too quiet, and you're not sure which one is you. Here's the key recognition. Identity isn't singular, it's contextual. Different versions of you come online depending on perception, environment, and alignment. Most of the time, this happens seamlessly. But during reorientation, the switching becomes noticeable. That's what you're feeling, not fragmentation, transition. The mind doesn't like this. It wants continuity. It wants a stable self-image it can predict from. So it asks questions like, who am I becoming? What version of me is this? Am I losing myself? But those questions assume identity is something you decide. It isn't. It's something you occupy. Think of it like tuning a signal. You didn't destroy the old frequency. You just stopped broadcasting from it, and the new frequency isn't fully locked in yet, so reception feels intermittent. Moments of clarity, moments of fog, moments where everything clicks, followed by moments where nothing makes sense again. That's normal here. If your sense of me feels slightly unstable, that doesn't mean something is wrong. It means you're no longer over-identifying with one position. This is also why you may feel strangely compassionate toward your past self. Not proud, not ashamed, just understanding. You see why you made those choices, why those fears existed, why those desires mattered, but you don't feel pulled to relive them. That's a sign of integration, not distance. At the same time, you may feel a quiet pull toward things you can't yet justify, interests without explanation, curiosity without urgency, resonance without narrative. The mind tries to ignore these signals because they don't come with instructions, but they're accurate. They belong to the version of you that's coming online. Here's something subtle. You don't jump between versions, you slide, gradually, and during the slide, nothing fully fits. That's why this phase feels uncomfortable, not because you're lost, but because you're no longer anchored to a single identity, and anchoring felt safe. Later, people describe this period as waking up slowly, not suddenly realizing something, but slowly realizing they no longer had to perform themselves. They didn't need to maintain a persona. They didn't need to keep reinforcing a story. They could let alignment do the work. This is where many people first resonate deeply with ideas like parallel realities, not because they suddenly believe something abstract, but because the language finally matches the sensation they're already having, that sense of standing between versions, that sense of choosing without force, That sense of reality responding differently depending on where you're standing internally. And here's the quietest truth of all. You don't need to figure out which version you are. You'll feel it. Because the version that fits doesn't require effort to maintain. It feels stable without being rigid, present without being intense, clear without being loud. If this block feels strangely personal, that's because it doesn't introduce anything new. It simply gives shape to something you've already been sensing. And sensing doesn't rush. There's nothing you need to do with what you've heard. That's important, because this wasn't information. It was recognition. And recognition doesn't ask for action. It settles. You might notice after this ends that your mind tries to wrap it up, to summarize, to label, to decide what it means. That impulse is familiar. It's the same impulse that tried to name the quiet as indifference, the pause as delay, the transition as something wrong. You don't have to fight that impulse, just notice it. What's been happening this whole time isn't dramatic. No breakthrough, no revelation, just a gentle correction in how you've been reading yourself, a slight adjustment in perception, and perception is everything. Reality doesn't change because you understand something, it changes because you stop misunderstanding it. That shift doesn't announce itself, it shows up later, sideways, in the way certain choices feel easier, in the way some worries don't return, in the way effort stops feeling heroic. You may realize, days from now, that something you used to question no longer asks for your attention, not because it was solved, because it's no longer relevant to who's standing here now. That's how identity updates, quietly. There's a reason this phase is easy to miss. It doesn't hurt enough to demand attention. It doesn't excite enough to feel important. It just hums in the background, until one day you notice you're living differently without having decided to. If this felt familiar, it's because you've been here before. Not in content, in experience. The moment before clarity returns, the space before direction reappears, the stillness before alignment takes over. You don't need to hold on to any of this. The recognition will do that on its own, like a conversation that doesn't end when the room goes quiet. It continues internally, softly. And if, at some point, you find yourself drawn to exploring this terrain more deeply, not for answers, but for language that keeps pace with experience, you'll recognize where to look. Not because you're searching, because something resonates. For now, it's enough to let this settle. No conclusions, no next steps, just the quiet awareness that maybe nothing was wrong with you, only the way you were reading the moment you were already in, and that reading can change.